Wake, a novella by Mike Spinelli, Chapter 1. 2 Men and a Boat. It was dark, and the 2 men and the boat were already a good distance out to sea. The boat motored along at an even if slightly lumpy pace, feeling the pre-dawn tide thumping along the hull. The scruff-looking man powering the boat was cold, but he was ignoring that right now. There was extreme fun to be had up ahead, and cold be damned. The other man lay unconscious in the bottom of his glorified tin dinghy with an engine. His hands and ankles were zip-tied behind him, and while he slept, he dreamed. The sound of the waves crashing against the side of the craft and the salty open sea air brought events back up from his pre-teen subconscious and made his dreams bad. And here he was, indeed, lying unconscious in a not-so-big boat, headed further and further out to sea with a very mad man at the wheel. Oh, how upset he was going to be when he would wake, so upset. The man above him, steadfast and with purpose, powered on, constantly checking for that glow between the ocean and the sky that signified the approaching dawn. He looked again, and still nothing. There was some small amount of time left before he arrived at his destination, but he was getting close. He could feel it. How many times he had come out here like this, spilling blood? Most certainly. He was bloodthirsty tonight, not that you would know by the look of him. The man behind the wheel was as calm as a dead Buddhist monk on Thorazine, which is to say, passive. The man at the bottom of the boat was starting to stir. The up and down thud, 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 coming from the boat, speeding through the small wave after wave, was bringing him around. He moaned loud. Mr. Bus Driver hit the brakes some, and the boat began to slow. The wind, while certainly still blowing, calmed a bit. The incessant bumping and thudding that had been going on for some time became a deep purr of the engine. Now it was just that, and water getting out of the way of the broad bow of the boat. The man stirred again, wincing in pain. He was coming to, face down, and his head was throbbing. He was bound wrist and ankle, cold and soaking wet on top of it all. Needless to say, he was confused. He looked up at the man across from him, and the man stared right back. There was no give in his face. He knew now that he should probably be scared and not just simply confused. He just didn't know why yet, and that seemed to move him from the category of should probably be scared to just plain old scared. He was shaking all over. At first it was just from being cold and wet, and soon after from everything else. He used what little leverage he could muster from the position of his legs to hoist himself up, his back against the metal bench in the middle of the boat. In a way of it was funny. Despite the cold, despite the wet, despite the sounds of the engine and the up and down repeated thuds and bumps that signify the look, feel, and sound of a boat moving through the water, despite all of that, the man in the bottom of the boat left behind what he would soon realize were actually sweet dreams he was having for sheer terror when he realized precisely where he was. He started taking long, panicked breaths. He tried to say, "Where am I?" but it came out as a stutter and garble. Nothing. The man stared straight ahead and said nothing. "Please," he begged. Where am I?" He choked, then coughed. Nothing still. More and more frightened, he lashed out, "Talk to me!" The look on the rugged man's face driving the boat suggested he sensed defiance and a demand. He flashed a look which, if looks could kill, would have caused him instant death. The look was nasty enough to immediately gain the silence that it had been seeking. The dark was still dark, and not much anything else could be seen except the dull shimmy of their immediate surroundings. A new moon was nearly upon the earth, and only a sliver of silver remained, casting the faintest of flashlights on their own private spot in the sea. The once screaming man, who had moments earlier laid an unwise demand upon a man he did not know or understand, but feared, realized this was not the approach he should be taking here. He took a moment to try and slow his still racing and panicked heart and mind. He took a quick stock of inventory on his current situation. It was not looking good. He was on the water, somewhere, with someone, and he knew absolutely jack shit about either of those two things in particular. All he knew beyond that were that his hands and feet felt useless to him, and he had a massive fucking headache. He breathed in slow and deep. "Sir!" The man in the bottom of the boat spoke softly. He repeated and augmented, but softly still. "Sir! How did I get here?" The man driving the boat glanced away, much slower than the last turn of his head, but still no softer in his gaze. "Ask," the dark pilot thought to himself, "and ye shall receive." Wake by Michael Spinelli. Chapter 2. Shopping. The same scruff, rugged man who only a few hours from now would be powering a boat out to sea at a decent speed was at this very moment sitting at the wheel of an entirely different vehicle altogether. He sat in a relatively late model Japanese car. He would never answer directly when asked what car he drove. These Japanese cars made him afraid of being ridiculed when he would invariably mispronounce it. He would just say foreign. He had heard somebody at the dealership remark that the vehicle's name might be pronounced like Sunday, but he thought the person might have been, in his estimation, a retard. He knew people didn't like that word anymore these days, but when he grew up it was rampant and used for just about anything in the world of an insults. But it was his go-to word for 40 years. What was he going to do? No, the hell with that, he thought. Foreign car it is, and forever it shall be. He sat there behind the wheel waiting for someone to come out of the grocery store. The right someone. Plenty of people had come waltzing in and out of there for the last 40 minutes or so. Not the right person. He had started to wonder if he had missed him, but the man's car was still parked where it had been when it had first arrived nearly an hour ago. But he was patient. His patience would outlast his panic, as it always did, and tonight, as in most nights, it would pay off here. Just a few moments later, a man emerged alone, cart chock full of groceries and bags. The man with the groceries cart was full of breakfast, lunch, and dinner that would soon spoil. Was a teacher, a gym teacher, but a teacher nonetheless. He was well regarded by most of the staff and some of his students even. His name was James Flanagan Jr., or Jim Jr., as his whole family had called him as far back as he could remember. Jim Jr. was the gym teacher, walked to his car with his Volkswagen, a red Volkswagen Beetle. He stepped to the trunk, pressed a button on the keychain, popping it open, and began the tedious job of loading groceries from car to car. He managed to be one of the few people that still requested paper bags from his grocer, not plastic. He did his part to save the world when he could. He believed heavily in this global warming thing and the naturalistic theories regarding cause and effect. He was no scientist or even science teacher, but he certainly had his own opinion, and he was going to be damned if he was going to listen to some money-hungry soul deny it was happening. He took the paper groceries bags out two at a time until he was done, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the car. He looked cautiously both ways before slowly backing out of his parking space an inch at a time until he was absolutely sure no one was coming, and then he drove off towards home, completely oblivious and unaware that he was being watched and stalked, clueless to the fact that here, in this very moment, he was a little pig in the company of the big bad wolf. The wolf drove a couple of cars back, keeping the little pig feeling all safe and cozy in his tiny house of straw. Jim Jr. only lived about 10 minutes from the store, so it did not take him long for both of them to reach their final destination. The gym teacher parked, not noticing the other car that parked a mere 20 feet away. He turned the ignition to the off and then removed the keys, and then himself from the car. He walked casually around to the back, whistling and spinning his keys coolly around his left forefinger. He caught the key ring mid-swing and nailed the truck button with his thumb as the door popped open once more. Removing bags this time, he took out two at once, stacking them in the crook of one arm as he snagged a third with the hand currently holding the keys. He took that now half-full second hand and pushed the trunk closed. There were more packages still to get, but he would key into the house and put these on the kitchen table and then return for the rest, three at a time until the end. He hated leaving the trunk open with groceries or items of any kind and wanted to nail this in 2 trips, not 3. He didn't live in a bad neighborhood, but why tempt fate, he thought. Besides, he was exhausted. He was simply not in the mood. It had been a long day at school, on top of a long month in general, and he had had enough. He was so tired, in fact, that he did not see the beast crouched right there in the weeds, waiting breathlessly, silently for his prey to resume drinking from the waterhole. Jim Jr. felt it for a moment, but did just like so many of us that have the gut feeling that we are being watched, and yet at that key moment when it matters most, we disregard it. We push aside at our peril. Jim Jr. took the hand with the keys and only one paper bag clutched with the last 3 free fingers and tried to put the key into its lock while balancing the other 2 bags on his knee. It was quite the sight. It was then, just then, as Jim Jr. moment most awkward and vulnerable, that the wolf sprang from the dark brush and slammed the gym teacher, forehead first, into his really hard wooden door. Jim Jr. fell straight to the ground in a heap of flesh and bone. The force from the impact sent groceries scattered in all directions, inside and out of the house. The darkly dressed man then took a small club from behind himself and added one more solid thud to the back of Jim Jr.'s crown, assuring that he would sleep for some time. He dragged the unconscious teacher's body into the house all the way and slammed the door closed. No one on the street or in their home heard of anything. Once inside, he bound his wrists and ankles and began the next step of his oft-rehearsed plan. Step 1. He would find every suitcase in the house and fill it with every clothing, leaving all things of value, jewelry, television, Blu-ray player, whatever. There must be absolutely no sign of breaking or robbery at all. Step 2. Retrieve wallets and identification, credit cards, and all pertinent paperwork, files, thumb drives, all to be disposed of. Step 3. Removing numbers and license plates after abandoning car down by the pier. Keys and ignition ready to be lifted by whomever. Step 4. Back to the house, collect the gym teacher, and be on his way. The savoury-looking man handles step 1 and 2 with ease. Step 3 took some time, but time he had. He gave Jimbo a tranquilizer shot to the upper left ass cheek to guarantee his slumber in his stead. He drove the long 30 minutes to the docks and left it under a street lamp for all the criminal underworld and vagrants to see. Then, dressed dark as the night, he crept amongst the vast shadows of the bay. He walked nearly 3 miles before hopping a bus back to Midtown and then traveling the remaining 3 miles back to the teacher's digs on foot. It was just about 1 in the morning, and he was beginning to pick up the pace. Right now, time was on his side, but he knew that could always go south. Sometimes all your plan ever is a list of shit that doesn't happen. But that be damned too. He was going to do it or die trying. That's just who he was. Once the wolf has its prey in his mouth, there was no letting go. This would certainly be no different. He keyed back into the house and found the gym teacher to be snoozing right where he had left him. He loaded his truck with the suitcase, then he went back inside, steel gloved, and wiped down anything he might have passed in his travels, even though he damn well knew he touched nothing. He had shaved his head, arms, and legs clean the day before. He was a cautious man, and he was quite aware that when this one went missing, the world around him would notice. They would notice, and then they would come looking as squeaky clean as he was leaving everything. He knew someone would notice, and when they did, they would look for any and every damn hair, print, track, smudge, stain, and fucking fiber that they could get their eyeballs and ultimately hands on. When they had exhausted their efforts of finding evidence, they would begin the process of finding what evidence there wasn't. He was careful when he had to be, and now he knew he had to be. He threw the t-shirt in the back of his vehicle, stopped to take one more complete look around, one more look to check for any faces or light peering from windows, random or hidden in shadows walkways. Holding his gaze and tilting his head to pick up any movement or sound he may have missed in his first sweep. Nothing. He closed the gate to the pickup and slipped into the driver's seat. He took the keys to the ignition and smiled, angling his head towards his catch in the back. He turned the key and she turned over nice and easy. He pulled away, driving plus or minus 2 miles per hour around the speed limit, making sure to come to every complete stop at every stop sign, red light, crosswalk, or railroad track. With every turn came a judicious use of the blinker for a solid 100 feet before the turn. He had been driving for nearly 40 minutes, and he was almost where he needed to be. He had begun to slow down as he was fast approaching an intersection he knew whose light changed quickly. Sure as it, he was 50 yards away, and it went from green to red so fast. Its speed was as if it was with a certain disdain for yellow. This traffic light was the last touch of normal dry land civilization before the isolated beachfront that lay just a few miles ahead. He sat in his vehicle, quiet and still, waiting for the light to change back to green the way it had to red. No such luck. He kept looking in the rear view and was making himself paranoid. He could not see any lights, but he felt off. If he had a spidey sense, this is where they would be tingling. He heard a thunk from behind him in the bed of the truck. He looked over his shoulder to catch, still unconscious, snap its legs out in a spasm of sort and rock his head further into the side of the truck. He almost laughed, but something else caught his eye. Just past the height of the truck bed, he was a cyclist. Well, what the Sam hell, he thought to himself. He asked the question, and his mind, ever so kindly, answered. He knew exactly what this was at 2-something a.m. It was a cop on a bike. He was almost 50 yards away. You've got to be kidding me, he thought out loud to no one. Come on, light. He kept looking from the light to the biker approaching casually. He needed to have the light change, and now, if the cop got up close enough to see a plate, make, model, or color, he was effed. There was no plan B. Would he kill the cop? He wondered to himself, internally this time. Then, just as the answer was about to creep into his mind, his question was answered for him. The light flashed green, and he stepped firm but gentle on the gas and not going. He watched the cop fade into blackness as he looped back, turning around after reaching the light. End of jurisdiction. 5 or so more miles down the road became a series of turnoffs to the left. Heading down to the water, he pulled off one of the particular paths that he had recently made himself. His own little known spot, his entrance to the Gulf of Mexico. There wasn't a gas station for miles. There wasn't anything or anyone anymore, for that matter, especially at this time in the morning. The last life he had seen was left back with the bicycle cop over 5 miles ago. This was the beaten path, off the beaten path. Finally, there it was. He had cleared the tall grass and made it to the wet and sandy small patch of the beach. The dark, purposeful man threw the pick up and park and got out. His cheap but sturdy metal boat tied off to a mangrove right where he had left it. He cleared past the brush. He thought to himself about his near miss with the Schwinn patrol that had rattled his cage for a moment, but only a moment. He was back to business and back on track, being that he was nearly at the finish and could not let up or relax now. The boat was just big enough for the 2 men and a few supplies, but small enough to mostly go unnoticed at this hour and in this light. He began to pack the boat with his prize, with a capital P, and some other supplies. He gently dropped the teacher into the boat, clunking his head carelessly against the inside hull, accompanied by a gong-type noise. A small anchor, a large bucket, a life preserver, and some rope. Then he himself joined the teacher. He was doing well. It was not quite 3 a.m. yet. He had nearly 3 hours to go before sunup, and he had a way to go and then the same to coming back. Not wasting any time, he untied the rope from the tree limbs and pushed off, floating out of ground's way. He waited about 30 seconds and then pulled start the engine. As he crept slowly and silently out to sea, he waited until shore was just but a blue before he opened up the engine's throttle to its fullest, loudest potential. It was dark, and the 2 men and the boat were already a good distance out to sea. The boat motored along at an even, if slightly bumpy pace, feeling the pre-dawn tide thump-thump